Hello students, today we are going to dive into chapter 3 and into what they call the first flowering of dynastic ancient Egypt as we know it. So here we go into chapter 3. Let me get to my slideshow. And there we are. Okay. So, following the first two dynasties, so that would have been the dynasties that included the Scorpion King, sometimes they call that Dynasty 0, and then King Narmer or Menes. So following those two dynasties, the third dynasty formed a further period of transition when large decorated palettes and mace heads actually ceased to be produced. Stone vessels of previous dynasties were still prized, but productions of new examples diminished, and the king's funerary complex developed differently from the tombs of the elite, as we've seen so far, and was now built entirely of stone, stone being something that lasts forever, instead of mud brick with some stone elements. And of the four or more Third Dynasty king, the best known is Djoser, and this is actually his funerary complex that we're looking at, and it's built of limestone, and we know it today as the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, because that's where it's built. And as you can see, it's not a perfectly smooth equilateral triangle on each side. Instead, it kind of resembles steps going up to a peak. And just as the first and second dynasties took elements from the late pre-dynastic period and used them as part of their new coherent statement of kingship, so a lot of the individual elements in Djoser's now new and novel funerary complex originated in the royal funerary complexes of the early dynastic period, but they were combined differently. So here is a nice diagram of the whole layout. In the center, you can see the step pyramid of Djoser there, and then the whole thing was enclosed by a huge stone wall that was nearly 35 feet high, and it was built to look like a palace facade. Now, the palaces that the pharaohs lived in did not survive because they were made out of mud brick. However, the ones that they needed for the afterlife were made of stone so that they would last forever, and they were just facades. They weren't actual buildings, and corresponding with that, there's 14 entrances, but 13 weren't real entrances, and the only one at the southern end of the east wall was the one that allowed the living access into the whole complex. And then the shape of the enclosure with one functional entrance on the east side recalls the early dynastic funerary enclosures that we saw at Abydos. And within the enclosure, the superstructure of Djoser's tomb actually began as a square structure as a mastaba tomb, resembling the ones we found within the royal enclosures at Abydos, but then they added 3 progressively smaller squares on top of that, and that gave it 4 steps. And then it was enlarged yet again. Another 2 steps were added until finally it was about 197 feet altogether. And everybody just loved this, and this kind of set the tone for what was to come. So there was a roofed and colonnaded corridor leading from the entrance, opening into a large rectangular court lying to the south of the pyramid, which you can kind of see here. And at each end, on a north-south axis, were a pair of crescent-shaped stones, north of which, in front of the step pyramid itself, was a stone platform that would be approached by steps. And then a very similar configuration of these elements occurs in early dynastic scenes, for example, on the Narmer mace head that we saw in chapter 1 and on an ebony label of King Den. And Kemp suggests that early dynastic palaces contained a large open area with platform and that set of crescent-shaped stones, which you can see a little bit better here, at least what remains of them. And that symbolizes the limits of the king's territory. And this area would have functioned as a setting for the formal appearance of the king on state occasions, such as the presentation of booty as in the spoils of war that the king would have gotten, not, booty like booty call all. So presentation of booty or tribute to the king, and also for the main royal ritual in which the king symbolically claimed his territory by actually running around the territorial stones. And this great arena and its paraphernalia were incorporated into the whole step pyramid enclosure. And again, it's the idea that this could go on eternally. The king could perform the rituals associated with his kingship eternally. And then 3 out of 6 limestone relief panels set up in the substructure of the funerary complex actually show Djoser running between those territorial markers. And here's what that looks like. Again, it kind of looks a lot like the Narmer palette, except he's supposed to be running here. And so here he's shown performing the ritual before the Great White One, who was a baboon deity known from the early dynastic time. And the image of the king is surrounded by all the symbols of his office. So you can see you've got an Ankh hieroglyph, you've got a Waz hieroglyph, and they all have little teeny arms holding scepters and so forth, kind of cute, sort of. And then he's also got the sacred standard bearing the image of the jackal god, again being carried by the Waz. And the Waz hieroglyph was a scepter that you would see the deities actually holding. My friend Michael actually had one made for himself because he loves things like that. I'll see if I can get that on film for you and share it with you so you get an idea of what that actually would have looked like. And so the translation of Waz is dominion, and that encompasses a concept of power and authority closely associated with kingship. And then above the king is a divine bird, probably either a falcon, the falcon for Horus, or the vulture of Nekbet, and in its claws it's holding the Shen hieroglyph of eternity, that little circle with the bar on the bottom. It's supposed to look like a knotted circlet, I guess you could say. And then 2 more hieroglyphs with arms stand behind the king, one above the other holding fans. And the lower hieroglyph is another Waz scepter. The other one is the Ankh sign, as I mentioned, the hieroglyph for life. And like the Waz scepter, it's carried by deities and closely associated with divine kingship because life is a gift from deities to the king. And below the hieroglyphs are 2 symbols that write the word Medinbu, which means limits, and like those semicircular stones represent the extent of the king's rule. And then the boundary markers themselves between which the king runs are placed 3 in front and 3 behind his feet. And his stride easily encompasses the distance between them, visually expressing his royal authority over his territory. And the king, again, is identified by his Horus name, Netjereket, written within the serach that you see here, that rectangular shape with the Horus falcon on top of it. And the king is referred to in later texts as Djoser, but that Horus name does not appear on contemporary monuments. Instead, he's known generally as Djoser, but here he's known as Netjereket. And he's also wearing the familiar white crown, that cone. He's also wearing a bull's tail on his skirt, if you can call it that. And he's carrying a flail, which is an item of royal insignia already associated with the king by the time of the First Dynasty. And like Narmer, he's wearing a beard, but Djoser's beard is a lot longer. It's broader, it's square at the end, it has horizontal lines running across it, and that form of beard especially was associated with the king. And from now on, we'll be seeing that beard on all of the pharaohs. And the royal figure also resembles Narmer. He has a short neck, small butt, and some representation of muscular, but not a lot else. And in addition to the fact that it's a little bit more subtly modeled, the shoulders are broader, the small of the back is a bit lower, the legs are shorter. And all of these change affect the relative sizes of the upper and lower parts of the body, and the small torso placed atop the long legs characterizes early dynastic royal figures that'll give way to proportions that are nearer to those that are found in actual living males. So where this came from, were they actually observing living male figures? I don't know. And then there's another ritual of kingship that's well known from later periods, and that's the Sed festival, which I think I mentioned earlier, and that was on those first dynasty objects. So later, the Sed festival was a festival that would be held after the king had ruled for 30 years, and it was in order to renew his kingship, and this was probably its original significance also. And during the Sed festival, the king wore a wraparound robe rather than his usual kilt, and he is shown here seated on two thrones. He's back to back, wearing, once the king of Upper Egypt, and on the other the king of Lower Egypt. And in reality, the thrones were probably placed side by side, and the king would perform them twice. And because the pyramid complex was designed to serve the dead king, it had to provide a place for his body and a location where his cult, honoring him as a god, could be performed. And the burial chamber would be cut into the rock beneath the pyramid and against the north side of the pyramid, facing the imperishable stars in the northern sky, amongst which the king hoped he was going, where he would pass eternity, was built the funerary temple, where the daily rituals and offerings for the dead king could be performed. And then to the east of this building, there's a small enclosed chamber known as a serdab, which is what you're seeing here. The opening is the serdab, and that into the serdab, and that would have a life-size seated image of the king statue, and then this would face towards the north wall of the serdab, into which two holes were cut to link the worlds of the dead and the living. And the statue was made of limestone. It would have been plastered and painted, and the eyes originally inlaid with gemstones probably. And so what you're seeing here, you can still see a bit of the white limestone clinging to the statue. The paint has long ago faded away, but he's wearing a very heavy, straighted tripartite wig of a type that's worn by deities, three parts. So you've got the two things on this side and one up here, so three parts, tripartite. And that assimilates the dead king to the divine world because he's wearing the same headdress as the deities. And the wig is partly covered by a striped headcloth, which is an early form of what we'll know as the Nemes headdress from the 4th dynasty on. And that completely covers the hair from the 4th dynasty onward. And he's also wearing a long beard, which has since been broken, and a thin mustache as well, and his body is wrapped in a long robe under which the right arm is held horizontally across his chest, right arm, and then the left forearm rests on his thigh with the extended hand palm down. And so that reminds us of Khazak Khem's statues, and the seat is also very close and formed of Khazak Khem's seat. It's very shallowly cut. You can see that there's a space between the legs, but it's not cut all the way through. As I've mentioned, it looks as though he is embedded into his throne. And we know who he is because there's an inscription on the base of the statue. And as I've said, these early kings look as though they're like literally embedded into their thrones. And then the statue was not actually made to be seen and admired by human eyes because it was walled into the serdab, but it did have a very practical function. It was what we call a Ka statue. So that means the Ka, that part of the soul, could manifest itself in order to benefit and observe the ritual. So it was believed that that part of his soul would actually come into the statue and observe all the things and all the offerings that were being carried into in front of the serdab. This is where the funerary priests would burn incense, they would make offerings, offerings. They would recite texts for the benefit of the king, and then the Ka would inhabit the statue, look out through the holes in the serdab wall, breathe in the incense, and draw out nourishing essence from the offerings. So you're probably wondering, well, what happens to all these offerings, all that food? Does it just rot forever? No. Actually, what would happen, I mean, this is all supposed to be a magical thing, but what is believed is that the priests would actually probably eat the food. Why would you waste all that food? And then fragments of statues that are found in the Step Pyramid complex show that this was by no means the only statue of the king that was set up there, and there's some statues of royal women that might have also been included. There's only the base remaining of one life-size statue of the king, but it is interesting for two reasons. One of which is that the king's feet, if you look closely at that middle image there, there's 9 archery bows cut in relief on the surface of the base. And the enemies of Egypt were traditionally called the 9 bows, and actually shown by a depiction of 9 bows. So here once again he is trampling on his enemies in quite a literal way. Triumphant over his enemies, triumphant over the forces of chaos. Once again we've got this whole thing about the king being the establisher of order, and we will find this same motif on king statues throughout the rest of pharaonic history. And the second point of interest lies on the inscription on the front of the statue base, which has not only the king's Horus name, but also the titles and name of the high official Imhotep. Imhotep is not the guy from the Mummy movies, okay? This Imhotep was actually very uncommon. Imhotep was a vizier. We think he was also the architect who is responsible for the creation of Djoser's full funerary complex. And so if that is all true, then he is the first recorded artist in history, the first recorded architect in recorded history. So that makes him very important. We don't need a fake guy from the Mummy movies in order to make that so. So in the 4th dynasty, we have a complete change in the layout of the king's funerary complex. The superstructure of the tomb was built in front of a true equilateral triangle with smooth sides instead of steps. They would cover it with limestone to make it even smoother, and it no longer sat in the middle of a large enclosure oriented north-south where the rituals of the king as the territorial ruler could be performed throughout eternity. Instead, we have the complex laid out as a series of elements in a linear sequence on an east-west axis. And at the western end, on the desert plateau, you have the pyramid itself marking the burial. And then in the middle of the east side of the pyramid would be the funerary temple where the cult for the king's Ka was carried out. So this is a nice aerial illustration of what that would have looked like at the height of the Old Kingdom. And then from here, there's a causeway. So what you can see looking at the slide is you've got the pyramid. In front of the pyramid is the funerary complex and the temple. And then running from that, that long line is actually a causeway that people could walk up and down to another temple. And one of the things it's thought, if you look in the upper right of the slide, you'll see blue. That's for the Nile River. And it was also believed that in ancient times that the Nile River would flood and would cover most of that area, but the causeways would still be walkable on. So that's, if you can kind of use your imagination to see what that might have been like. And then they would put the pharaoh's statue or body onto a boat that could then go up and down the Nile and be a lot like the myth of the sun god Ra, who rode a boat across the sky through all the hours of the day and night. So this was a very radically altered design and probably came about because there were changing ideas about kingship. And all of that points to already existing concepts of this divine power of the sun and the relationship between the god or the sun god and the king. And the true pyramid was also a symbol of the sun. It related to the Ben stone that stood in Heliopolis, which was the center of the sun cult. Helios is sun in Greek. Polis means city. Heliopolis, city of the sun. And the funerary temple was moved from the north side of the pyramid, where it related to the eternal life promised by the northern stars, instead to the east side. So now it is oriented to the rising sun, promising eternal life through the endless cycle of setting and rising. And we'll see through Egyptian history how the pharaoh is associated with the sun and the sun god. And for the first time, kings also started to call themselves sons of Ra, the sun god. The king's funerary monuments no longer catered for the king's eternal reenactment of the territorial rituals of kingship. Instead, the king now is an earthly manifestation of the sun god himself, expressed in the form of the king's filial relationship to Ra. And at death, he joined the sun god on his eternal cycle of renewal. So this did not preclude the king still being regarded as a manifestation of Horus. In fact, the Egyptians like to heap layers and layers upon their myths. So this identification with Horus still remained fundamental to the concepts of kingship until the end of the Pharaonic period, thousands of years later. So they did not come up with the perfectly equilateral, beautiful triangle pyramids that we saw at Giza right away. These are a bit later. It took them a little while to go from the step pyramids to the perfect equilateral triangle. So the new linear complex we see in the reign of Sneferu. He was the first king of the 4th dynasty, and this is his pyramid at Meidum, and we believe this belonged to Sneferu according to graffiti that was left later in the 18th century, and it was originally built with steps that were later filled in to form a true pyramid. This is what exists now. And the pyramid was surrounded by a pavement, a mud plaster, and a stone enclosure wall. And unlike the step pyramid complex, the only building within the enclosure was a small funerary temple placed against the middle of the east face of the pyramid. And the temple contained a limestone offering table where the daily offering ritual would have been performed, and that it was flanked on either side by a round topped limestone stela. And these would have named the king to whom the pyramid belonged, but they were never actually carved. The causeway led from a point in the enclosure wall virtually next to the funerary temple down to the valley temple, some 705 feet away on the edge of cultivation, and that has not been excavated because the site is now waterlogged. Nature sometimes makes archaeology very difficult. But here you can see a drawing of what it would have looked like when everything was at its height, sort of, more or less. And then we have the bent pyramid at Dashur, and that is called such because the angle of the face changes partway up, and we believe this also belonged to Sneferu. Again, they had a couple tries before they got to, the perfect pyramids as we know them today. And there's a small funerary temple on the east side with an offering table and a very tall stela on either side. And the stela, which was found in fragments, had been decorated with the names and titles of Sneferu. And unlike later true pyramid complexes, the causeway entrance to the bent pyramid lay at the eastern end of the north, not the east side of the enclosure, and the causeway led to a monumental temple that actually lay in a depression in the desert rather than on the edge of the cultivation. And the resources put into this temple were considerable, especially when compared with what would have originally been the rather small funerary temple. So it was rectangular in plan and built of the local stone that was faced by the very fine limestone that they would have gotten in quarries across the river at Torah. And outside the front wall of the court that lay before the temple entrance, there were 2 more stela for Sneferu erected. And then an entrance led from the horizontal court into a narrow wall flanked on either side by 2 rooms. You can see that in this nice little cutaway here drawing, and then beyond the hall lay an open court with a pillared portico at the far end consisting of 2 parallel rows of 5 rectangular columns. And then finally at the back of the building were 6 shrines, their openings corresponding to the spaces on either side of and between the columns. And then along the walls of the narrow entrance hall, the thicknesses of the door into the open court and the sidewalls of the portico, we have carved what you see here. There are female offering bearers, and they represent estates whose produce would have supported the funerary cult of the king, and they were divided into groups according to the district or the nome, N-O-M-E, in which the estates were situated, with Upper Egyptian estates on the west and Lower Egyptian ones on the east. And these scenes again stress the importance of supplying the dead with food and other offerings, and we'll see this again and again. But this is the first example where we actually see the estates that were set aside to supply the king's cult, and also shows how large the cult would have been. The scenes also give us a record of the estates that contribute to the cult, also provides a means of supplying the king's ka should the offering cult cease. Again, it was believed they would come alive and, assure that he would get provisions throughout eternity. And these estates are shown here as being female because the key word in all of their names is for the hieroglyph hut, and it's a feminine grammatical gender indicator, so it's seeing the personification of the estates as female. And then the shrines at the back of the temple were closed by double-leaved wooden doors. The walls on either side of the niches were decorated with a standing relief figure of the king facing towards the niche. The back of the niche itself was carved into a statue of the king, and the statues housed the ka of the dead king and were the recipients of offerings. So here again we have that. And then the relief statues of the king were placed under the hieroglyph sign for sky, which would be decorated with stars and protected by flying vultures representing the goddess Nekhbet, or by falcons representing Horus. And the figures were identified by the king's Horus name and his cartouche. So what's a cartouche? Okay, so remember the little round Shen ring with like the little bar at the bottom? Imagine that, take that, pull it open, and you've got an oval. That's what makes a cartouche. And so from now on, in going forward in Egyptian antiquity, we have the cartouche identifying the king's name. And then the baseline on which the king stands is drawn in the forms of land and earth. So basically what it's trying to show us is that the king is central in the cosmos. He's between the sky above and the earth below. And then elsewhere we see the king being embraced by various deities, showing that they accept him. This looks like it might have been Sekhmet, because that looks like a lioness head. And then the decorations of the temple have a carefully concealed program relating to the offering cult of the dead king and his position in the cosmos. And later in his reign, Sneferu built a second pyramid at Dashur, now known as the Northern Pyramid. So his successor was Khufu, and it's with Khufu that we have the building of the Great Pyramid at Giza, and this is the largest pyramid to ever be built in Egypt. And what I will tell you right now is, rather than reading through all of this, is that from now on, throughout the Old Kingdom, this is how the pyramids are built. However, so we've got Khufu, we've got Khufu's son Khafre, and then Khafre's son Menkaure, and those three form the great big pyramids that we see at Giza. And this is the first time and the only time we'll see pyramids built on this scale, built this huge. Probably because of the commandeering of resources, both human and material. It was never seen again. I mean, it was probably something. The scale, the economical output that you would have had to create something on this scale 3 times, not once but 3 times, would have been enormous and probably a strain on the Egyptian economy. So we never see this again quite so huge. But in any case, Khufu is the first to build a great pyramid, and it is the largest. And as in other pyramids, we have the entrance in the north, funerary temple on the east. An entrance on the temple's east side led into a court that was paved with black basalt, and then around the 4 sides of which we have a portico with pillars of granite. And then there's evidence that the limestone walls were at one time decorated with relief scenes. Not much survives today. At various times in history, both the Sphinx is also near this complex, and the Sphinx and the pyramids have been covered with with sand at various times, and also in antiquity, things that were ancient, or which would have been ancient to people 100, 200 years later, old things were not as important. So all of the pyramids have had their original limestone casing removed and used on other buildings. So little survives of the original relief scenes. And some of the fragments actually came from the processions of the estates. That's what you would have seen. And then there's other scenes relating to the Sed festival. And Khufu's Valley Temple actually lies under a modern-day settlement where people live today, so it's not been excavated. So I don't know if they'll ever do that. Would be cool to see. But, this is what happens over time. Stuff gets built on top of stuff. So there's a lot of reasons why we don't know everything we could possibly know. The next king, Rajadef, built his pyramid at Abu Rawash, but there's very little left of it. And then Rajadef's successor, Khafra, returned to Giza for his burial site and built the second so-called second pyramid. And we do know more about this pyramid complex, which includes the Sphinx, than we know about Khufu's, although there's still a ton of things we don't know. For example, who exactly built the Sphinx, how exactly old the Sphinx is. There's a lot of theories about that, but in any case, Khufu made use of different types and colors of stone, and that tradition was continued in Khafre's time. Khafre was Khufu's son, and the building itself, as I said, was covered with dazzling white limestone. The lowest course was covered with red granite, but very little of that exists today. You can still see some of the limestone clinging to the very top of Khafre's complex, but that's all that remains. And then both the funerary and valley temples combine the use of red granite for some walls and pillars with floors of white calcite. And the funerary temple was more elaborate than earlier buildings. It was the first to include all the elements of an entrance hall, an open court, 5 statue niches, an offering chamber, and storage rooms. And those elements actually will become standard in funerary temples in the 5th and 6th dynasties, but their arrangement will vary from temple to temple. And then there were 12 seated statues of Khafre at one time that stood in front of the red granite pillars of the court, and they would have projected outward from recesses, and the limestone walls of the court were probably decorated with reliefs, since a depiction of a bound Asiatic prisoner was found. And by contrast, the Valley Temple itself contained no relief decoration, although the entrance doorways were surrounded by a band of hieroglyphs that give the names and the titles of the king. And the main part of this temple was in the shape of an inverted T, as you can see in this diagram, with 6 square granite pillars forming a horizontal line down the center of the crossbar and 2 parallel lines of 5 pillars in the stem. The main decoration consisted of 23 seated statues of the king. None of these were found in situ, meaning as they would have been, but their original locations and number are shown by the markings of their emplacements in the floor. So here's an artist's recreation of what they would have looked like when they were in situ. So there's one almost intact statue that remains, and then there's 6 others that were less well preserved. They were found in 1860, and for some reason they were buried in a pit in the floor of the temple. No idea why. These surviving pieces are of very high quality. They also illustrate a fundamental characteristic of Egyptian art, which was a dislike of absolute repetition. None of them absolutely resemble another. They each have details that differentiate them. Oops. So this is what the best preserved statue looks like. There are 2 groups, those that sit on a high back seat with figures of lions forming the sides, like on the arms of the chair. And then there's those where the king sits on a simple block seat with no back. He's wearing the Nemes headdress. He's looking straight forward. He's very stiff, as you can see. He's got both forearms on his thighs. The right hand is clenched into a fist, and again, the left hand lies palm down. That's something we see with these statues of the kings, and the statues are inscribed with the versions and the titles and the names of Khafra arranged differently on each one. And the best preserved statue is about 5.5 feet high. It's made from diorite, which is quarried west of Toshka in the Nubian desert, which is beyond the border of Egypt to the south. And again, this shows us because it's to the south and that he could command such a large supply of this stone and have it brought into his kingdom shows how far-reaching his authority was. And the hard stone would have been finished with a high polish, and that enhances the beautiful grain that you can see in the stone. And then the effect of the dark stone against the red granite and the white calcite would have been very impressive. And then the rectilinear frontal qualities of the statue would have harmonized with the square pillars and the rectilinear form of the temple. And on the back of the seat, we have the Horus falcon behind the king's head, spreading his wings protectively. So the back of the head and the front of the falcon's body seem to merge into one. And again, this is the absolute expression of this idea that the king is under the protection of Horus, and he's also the manifestation of Horus on earth. And then on both sides of the seats between the chair legs, we have that Semitawi hieroglyph carved. And the large semi-hieroglyph is flanked by the plants of Upper and Lower Egypt, and their stems are knotted around the hieroglyph in order to symbolize, once again, the 2 parts of Egypt in the person of Khafra himself. And then some non-royal tombs. So in the 3rd dynasty, the high elite continued to build tombs at Saqqara with rectangular superstructures. And actually, if we go back some slides, you can listen to me sing. Okay, wait. There we go. Okay, so if you look at these pyramids, you can see lots of mastaba type tombs on all of them, those rectangular forms. Those are all tombs for people that were not the king, but were probably members of his court. So let's come back. There we go. So they continue to build the tombs, and we have these rectangular superstructures built sometimes of either mud brick casing, but an increasing use of stone elements, which is why some of them remain. And these are called mastabas, which is the Arabic word for bench. If you took Egyptian art, or not Egyptian art, African art with me, you may know that. And many mastabas continue to be plain on the outside with 2 offering niches on the east side side, one at the north, and the other at the more important south end. But the offering niches were often cut back into the structure to form a kind of cruciform room, which could be lined with stone and decorated. And in some Third Dynasty tombs, the use of the palace facade motif was revived, but only the most important east side would have the offering niches. The niched facade would then be protected by a plain wall extending out from the superstructure at either end and would run in front of and parallel to the facade. And a typical corridor chapel of this type can be found in the tomb of Hesira, dated by a clay ceiling to the date of Joseph, which is what you're looking at here. And when it was excavated, the protected panel facade still preserved the painted patterns that were to imitate reed matting. And then at the back of each 11 niches was originally carved a wooden panel, 6 of which survive in part, and each show, as you can see here, Hesra himself facing right, and in 5 of them he stands, 1 he sits. Here he's sitting before a table of half loaves of bread, and then on the opposite side of the corridor, on the inside of the protected wall, there are painted items of funerary equipment, beds, chairs, stools, boxes with their contents, and on the west wall of the outer corridor were remains of painted scenes that included a crocodile, men with cattle, and perhaps remnants of the early so-called everyday life scenes that became common during the Fourth Dynasty. And like the niche stones of the Second Dynasty, the function of the wooden paddles of Hesra was to, again, continue the existence of the deceased in the afterlife and provide all the things that were necessary to continue on in the afterlife. So the image of the deceased we can see there on the left most clearly, standing with the far leg advanced, holding a long staff in his forward hand, and a scepter in the rear one was the standard in funerary art, and the staff and scepter were symbols of authority, showing he was some kind of court official. And then there was another image that was being developed around this time in statuary. And then in the brick corridor chapel of Kabasokar, there are 2 niches that opened into separate cruciform chapels, again lined with these decorated limestone panels. And the more important southern chapel belonged to Kabasokar, and the subsidiary northern chapel belonged to his wife, Neferhotep Hathor, which means her name means the gods and Hathor are pleased. I'm not sure what Kabasokar means. I'll figure that one out later. But in both chapels, the back panels show the owner seated, as you can see here, on the left before a table of offerings, and the whole above a list of offerings. And then the side panels also show, this time, the owner standing facing outwards towards those who come into the chapels to perform the offering rituals. And then above the figures, we have columns of hieroglyph letting us know what their names are, what their titles are, again, to perpetuate their memories in this world and their continued existence in the next. And again, it's all about keeping the name alive. So for the ancient Egyptians, having your name recorded, your face recorded, was very important for continuation in the afterlife. It's how the gods would find you. And later on, we will see how if the Egyptians became displeased with you, they would simply scratch out your name so that you would cease to exist. But we'll see that a bit later in some things. So like the seated Kabasokar on the back panel, the hieroglyphs that identify him also face right, but then there's also hieroglyphs that are reversed facing left. So that is to indicate that they're being presented to him. And the separate offering list beneath refers to the primary right-facing orientation. But again, these are among the things that made deciphering hieroglyphs so difficult, because sometimes they go left to right, sometimes they go right to left, sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. Yeah. So let's see, this is a lot of text. I'm going to let you guys kind of read about this on your own, but this will tell you a little bit more about the whole idea of facing left or facing right. I don't know what that slide is supposed to be. That is terrible. I think it's just talking about subtleties in the way that the figures look. For example, God, this is terrible. What the hell happened? I'm going to have to find new slides for this because in one, he's shown at his physical peak, young, beautiful, and so forth. And then later on, he's more mature. He's got extra flesh that you would have in life as, say, somebody with a desk job. They eat well, but maybe not having a lot of exercise. And then we also have a small room with a serdab, that is essentially a serdab, with a Ka statue. And there's no statues that survive of Kabasokar or his wife, but there's other Third Dynasty statues that represent both men and women, seated and standing, that still exist today. So this is a statue of Ankwa, who was a shipbuilder, and that's made of red granite, and he's sitting on a rectilinear block seat. And I'll just let you guys look at that and make your own inferences from it. But the curve of bent wood was felt to be incompatible with rectilinear forms that dominate formal statues. And then in the Fourth Dynasty, we have a number of tomb chapels that are decorated with these everyday life scenes. Some of them already appeared in the Third Dynasty tomb of Hesera, and they weren't meant to be accurate records of what you did every day. Instead, they were created for the benefit of the deceased in the afterlife. And these, some of the best known are at Meidum. They have these beautiful paintings of all kinds of waterfowl, like you see here, and these belong to Ra-Hotep and his wife Nefret, and also to Nefermot and his wife Itet, dating to the reign of Sneferu. So the superstructures were made of mud brick, and the chapels lined with stone block, and the technique of decoration varied in the two tombs. In Nefermot and Itet, some of the scenes were painted, while others were incised and filled with colored paste, but in the tombs of Ra-Hotep and Nefret, the scenes were cut in raised relief and painted, and the technique using a fill of paste actually was not accepted later on and did not continue. And then in both tombs, what you have here is a false door, basically. It's very complex. As you can see, it's got several, looks like door jambs leading into it. And it's a false door, meaning that we, the living, cannot pass through it, but the deceased can. And the deceased can receive the offerings that we leave there. And then the traditional image of the deceased seated before a table of offerings would be carved on a panel above the central doorway. And in the chapel of Ra-Hotep, he was a king's son and also a high priest of Heliopolis. The deceased is shown seated on the left side of the scene, facing right. And then once again, we have the famous offering table, hieroglyphs, offering lists, yada, yada, yada. But in any case, in the chapel of Ra-Hotep, this area was occupied by the central element of the false door. And the false door and depictions of funerary items also occupied the rear of the chapel, and the rest of the wall space was covered with scenes of everyday life, showing the deceased doing things they might have enjoyed in life, like hunting, hunting in the desert, bringing desert animals, netting birds and fish, bringing in oxen, butchering oxen, plowing, block building, and all of these also have to do with supplying the needs of the deceased in the afterlife. And scenes like these became pretty much a repertoire of tomb decoration from then on. And then several scenes of everyday life appeared in the neighboring mastaba of Nefermot and Itet, and several painted fragments survive from a scene in the corridor of Itet's tomb, that once showed 4 men trapping birds in the marshes with a clap net, which you can see here, and then the net was left open with bait inside, and then when enough birds had been lured into it, the hunters pulled it shut with a rope, trapping the birds inside. So that gives us an idea of how they hunted in ancient times. And the first man in the scene is not pulling the rope, but is already holding a bird in each hand. That's what this fragment shows you. And the artist has very skillfully and very detailed shown us the different colors and the different textures of the plumage, and probably was this was a person who would have been important enough to have an artisan from the royal workshop, and the ability to command first-rate artists you would see in the tomb owner's wealth and status. And then the scene's function, as earlier, was to show that he had a perpetual supply of birds, table fowl in the afterlife. And then for some reason, the chapels in both mastabas were blocked off in ancient times, and new offering places for the cult were provided. So the chapel of Rahotep was turned into a kind of serdab where we have these statues, which if you took art history with me, you might have seen these. These show Rahotep and Nefret walled up until they were found in the 1870s by a French Egyptologist. And because they were protected, they've retained most of their paint. So they would have been covered with plaster and painted, and then the paint probably sank into the plaster. And it's possible that the statue of Nefret was originally meant to have been placed in the southern chapel, but for whatever reason she is here with Rahotep. And they are just under 4 feet high, and they're both facing forward. And you can actually tell a lot about fashion, for those of you that are into fashion, from looking at these. Women were wearing, very tight white garments. You can tell from the way that it clings to her body and down to her ankles that she probably wouldn't have been able to walk very easily. A lot of the Egyptian garments we see look like that. You can see the collared necklace that she's wearing and the crown that she's wearing, whereas Rahotep is simply wearing a white kilt. And a lot of people have asked, why is it that the male is dark and the female is light? Well, that was actually a product of the time. During this particular time in art history in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, males were always painted darker, females were painted lighter. We will see in later Egyptian history, pretty much everybody is brown. So, as I said, he is wearing just his white kilt and a single strand necklace that has a heart amulet. If you remember, the heart's considered the most important thing. He has short black hair. His eyes are rimmed in black paint. He's got a little mustache. And he also, is sitting on a kind of throne that has all kinds of hieroglyphs on it showing his titles, his name, and so forth. And his posture tells us that he was from the royal family. And then the horizontally held arm went out of fashion in the 4th dynasty. And his hieroglyph reads, in case you're wondering, Great One of Buto, overseer of transporters, overseer of the army, controller of archers, king's son of his own body, Rahotep, meaning he wasn't adopted, he was a biological son. The text on the right reads, Great One of the seers of Heliopolis, unique one of the great ones of the hall, hewer of the Ami's mace, eldest of the palace, unique one of the great ones at the palace of the beer measurers. And then here we have Nefret, and she is very clothed, unlike her husband there, and her body does seem, in fact, to merge with that seat rather than just emerge from it. And the straps of her dress are actually visible. She's kind of got, what's very fashionable today to have, your shoulders showing. And then she's got a full shoulder-length black wig, which you can see her own hair there. And that appears on her forehead. And then she's wearing what's called a fillet, which is a type of crown, and that has all kinds of brightly colored, stylized floral motifs. And then she's also got columns of black hieroglyphs on either side of her head, but she was not a government official like Rahotep, so she only has one title, the king's dependent. It's not an administrative office, just simply links him to his household and to the king himself. So she had high status, which you would expect from, the wife of a king's son and a high government official. So our conclusion here, so this is the 3rd dynasty forms a link basically between the formative period of the first two dynasties and then the classical pyramid age of the Old Kingdom initiated in the fourth dynasty. And elements from the early dynastic burials were reworked into a new configuration, the step pyramid, and that was transmuted in turn into the true solar pyramid as we know it at the beginning of the fourth dynasty. And at the same time, the form of royal and elite tombs, oh, for serious. I hate it when that happens. Where was I? Delete. Okay, there we go. Back. Okay, diverges sharply. Sorry about that. So the latter continued to be built, the non-royal tombs in the older mastaba form, following their own line of development and evolution of decorated tomb chapel scenes and scenes of everyday life, in addition to images of the deceased receiving offerings. Nevertheless, the monuments of the elite pale beside the huge size and undertakings of the royal pyramid complexes that proclaim the unique position of the king within the cosmos, and it is probable that the gap between the power of the king and his elite was never greater than in the fourth dynasty. So that concludes our third chapter, and I hope you all have enjoyed this, and we will move on to the next thing.